I teased the lesson, we're going to talk about difficulties. And as I'd mentioned before, somewhat it's prompted by thinking about our service members, both current and former, who are constantly in harm's way and always having to deal with the difficulties of life. And so my comments and my thoughts are with the veterans today, and that's why we're using this particular lesson. It's a fairly lengthy passage from the first book of the Bible, Genesis, starting at chapter 47 and then verses 13 through 21. The time eventually came when there was no food anywhere. The famine was that bad. Egypt and Canaan alike were devastated by the famine. Joseph collected all the money that was to be found in Egypt and Canaan to pay for the distribution of food. He banked the money in Pharaoh's palace. When the money from Egypt and Canaan had run out, the Egyptians came to Joseph. Food, please give us food. Are you going to watch us die right in front of you? The money is all gone. Joseph said, well, bring your livestock. I'll trade you food for livestock since your money's run out. So they brought Joseph their livestock, and he traded them food for their horses and their sheep and their cattle and their donkeys. He got them through that year in exchange for all their livestock. When that year was over, the next year rolled around, and they were back saying, Master, it's no secret to you that we're broke. Our money's gone, and we've traded you all our livestock. We've nothing left to barter with but our bodies and our farms. What use are our bodies if the land we stand here and starve to death right in front of you? Trade us food for our bodies and for our land. We'll be slaves to Pharaoh and give up our land. All we ask is seed for survival, just enough to live on and keep the farms alive. So Joseph bought up all the farms in Egypt for Pharaoh. Every Egyptian sold his land. The famine was that bad. That's how Pharaoh ended up owning all the land, and the people ended up slaves. Now, who of us can forget 9/11 or the day that will live in infamy, Pearl Harbor, or the Titanic sinking? I mean, calamities and difficulties can leave us many times feeling a little off balance, completely bewildered about things, or maybe just confused. So consider the difficulties of Joseph's generation. In fact, in Genesis chapter 47, verse 13, it says, the time eventually came when there was no food anywhere. The famine was very bad. Egypt and Canaan alike were devastated by the famine. So during the time that Joseph was struggling to reconcile with his brothers, and we've had that conversation before, he was also navigating this international catastrophe. It had been 2 years since the last drop of rain. The sky is now endlessly blue. The sun is relentlessly hot. Animal carcasses are littering the ground, and there is absolutely no hope whatsoever on the horizon. The land is a dust bowl. No rain meant no farming. No farming meant no food. When people appealed to Pharaoh for help, he said, go to Joseph. Whatever he tells you to do, do it. And we can read that in Genesis chapter 41, verse 55. So Joseph now is facing a calamity of global proportions. Yet, I want you to contrast the description of the problem with the eventual outcome. Years passed, And the people told Joseph the following in Genesis chapter 47, verse 25. You've saved our lives. Master, we are grateful to be slaves to Pharaoh. So the calamity begins, and people are giving Joseph money, livestock, farms, and themselves. And at the end of the calamity, they're thanking Joseph for saving their lives. In fact, they're grateful even to be slaves because but for that agreement, they would have been dead. So the people had remained calm. And a society that was totally ripe for anarchy actually is now thanking the government rather than attacking it. It kind of makes a person wonder if Joseph ever taught maybe a course in crisis management. If he did, he probably concluded the words that he told his brothers. In Genesis chapter 45, verses 5 through 7, Joseph tells his brothers this: God sent me before you to preserve life. For these 2 years, the famine has been in the land, and there are still 5 years in which there will be neither plowing nor harvesting. And God sent me before you to keep you and your families alive and to preserve many survivors. What a perspective by a person who is struggling, dealing with brothers who at one time had thought about killing him and then just decided to get rich on making him a slave. So Joseph in his heart and in his spirit is still conflicted about brothers who hated him so much that they wanted to see him dead, and yet now is thinking about the purpose and the reason for him being here, and that includes saving his own family and then many other survivors in Egypt. So Joseph began and he ended his problem assessment with references to God. Did you hear that? God sent me before you to preserve life. For these 2 years the famine has been in the land, and there are still 5 years in which there will be neither plowing nor harvesting. And God sent me before you to keep you and your families alive and to preserve many survivors. God preceded the famine. God would outlive the famine, and God was all over the famine. In Joseph's mind, it was God, famine, and God. And I was thinking, so how would you characterize your difficulties? Is it the economy, the economy, the economy? Or is it unemployment, unemployment, unemployment? Or is it divorce, divorce, divorce? With God nowhere in there, either at the beginning or at the end. I mean, do sometimes we start reciting our own woes during difficult times more naturally than we start reciting heaven's strengths? If so, then it's no wonder that sometimes life is really tough for us, right? You're assuming that God isn't in the difficult circumstance, but he is. Because even the famine in this context was fair game for God. Consider Isabel, for instance. She spent the first 3.5 years of her life in a Nicaraguan orphanage. No mother, no father, no promise of either one. And as with all orphans, the odds of adoption diminish with time. And every passing month decreased Isabel's chance of being placed in a loving home. And then the door slammed on her finger. You see, she was following the other children going outside to play when the screen door closed on her hand. And for little Isabel, it was very painful, and the pain shot up her arm, and her scream echoed across the entire playground. And you're thinking, why would God let that happen? Why would a benevolent, omnipotent God permit this innocent little girl with more than her share of difficulties to feel more pain? Well, maybe it was because he was calling for the attention of a man by the name of Ryan Schnoke. This was an American would-be father who was sitting in the room next to the playground. And he and his wife, Christina, had been trying to adopt a child for months and months and months. No other adult was around to help poor little Isabel, so Ryan walked over, picked her up, and then comforted her. Several months later, when Ryan and Christina were close to just giving up on adopting a child, Ryan remembered little Isabel and resolved to try one last time. And this time, the adoption succeeded. And little Isabel is now growing up in a very happy, healthy home. So, was it a finger in the door? You know, God doesn't manufacture pain, but he certainly puts it to use. In 1 Timothy chapter 6, verse 15, it says, God is the blessed controller of all things. In Isaiah chapter 55, verse 9, it says, his ways are higher than our ways. Paul, in writing to the church in Rome, in Romans chapter 11, verse 33, says, his judgments are unsearchable, and his paths are beyond tracing out. You know, church, we can't always see what God is doing, but can't we at least assume that God is up to doing something good? Joseph did. He assumed that God was in these difficult times. Then he faced the difficulties with a plan. He collected grain during the good years and redistributed it during the bad years. When the people ran out of food, he gave them food in exchange for money, and then livestock, and then property in themselves. And ultimately, Joseph was able to stabilize the economy, and he gave the people then thereafter a lesson in money management. And this is a bit of a paraphrase, but if you take a look at Genesis chapter 47, verse 24, Joseph tells the people of Egypt the following. Look, we've got this thing worked out now. We're past the famine. So here on out, give 1/5 to Pharaoh and use the rest for farming and for eating. I mean, the plan could have fit on an index card. Save for 7 years, distribute for 7 years, manage carefully. I mean, could his response have been any simpler? Probably not. But could it have been any more boring? Yeah. Some flamboyance maybe you think would have been nice here. I mean, maybe a little bit of the Jericho walls falling down, or maybe like a dead man walking like Lazarus, some sort of exciting lesson for Joseph to share with the people. Instead, he has an index card with a plan. Save for 7, redistribute for 7, and then manage wisely. I think sometimes we think that a dramatic set of circumstances requires some sort of dramatic response. And church, that's just not always true. We equate spirituality with high drama, like Paul raising the dead or Peter healing the sick. Yet for every Paul and for every Peter, there are a dozen Josephs. There are men and women who are blessed with skills of administration, some steady hands that through whom God can save people. Consider this. Joseph never, ever raised the dead, but he kept people from dying, didn't he? Joseph never healed the sick, but he kept sickness from spreading. He made a plan and stuck with it. And because he did, his nation survived. He triumphed with a very calm and very methodical plan. In the days that led up to the war with Germany, the British government commissioned a series of posters. The idea of the British government was to capture these encouraging slogans, put them on paper, and then distribute them around the entirety of the country. Capital letters were always used in this very distinct kind of typeface, and a simple two-color format was always selected. The only graphic in any of these posters was the crown of King George VI. The first poster was distributed in September of 1939. And you see it on the overhead. Your courage and your cheerfulness and your resolution will bring us victory. After that first poster was distributed, they created a second one. And in that second one, it said, "Freedom is in peril. Defend it with all your might." These two posters appeared up and down the British countryside. I mean, they were literally plastered everywhere, on railroad platforms, in the pubs, in stores, in restaurants. They were everywhere. And there was a third poster that was created, but it was never distributed. They created 2.5 million copies of this third poster. Yet the first time it was actually seen wasn't until 60 years later, when a bookstore owner in the northeast portion of England discovered one in an old box. It was some books that he had purchased, and this poster was in this old box of books. And here's what it said: "Keep calm and carry on." The poster bore that same crown and that same style of the first two posters, but this particular poster was never released to the public. It had been held in reserve for an extreme crisis, such as the actual invasion by Germany. The bookstore owner framed it, hung it on the wall, and it became so popular in his bookstore that he began producing this identical image on posters, mugs, postcards, everything. It seems everyone appreciated the reminder from another generation to simply keep calm and carry on. Of all the Bible heroes, Joseph is probably the one that would have likely hung this particular poster in his office. He indwelt the world of ledgers and flowcharts and end-of-year reports and tabulations and calculations, and he was doing this day after day and month after month and year after year. But for whatever reason, and I think we know why, he kept a cool head and he carried on. And church, you and I can do the same. We can't control the weather. We aren't in charge of the economy. We can't undo a tsunami or unwreck a car. But we can map out a strategy. Because remember that God is even in the difficulties. Ask him to give you an index card-sized plan and a couple of steps that you can take today. Seek some counsel from someone who's possibly faced similar challenges in the past. Ask friends to pray for you. Look for resources, but most importantly, have a plan. Management guru Jim Collins has some very interesting words on this particular subject. He and his partner, his name was Morton T. Hansen, studied leadership in turbulent times. They looked at more than 20,000 different companies, sifting through data in search of the answer to this one question. Why, in uncertain times, do some companies thrive while others do not? They concluded as follows, and I quote, "Successful leaders are not more creative. They're not more visionary. They're not more charismatic. They're not more ambitious. They're not more blessed by luck. They're not more risk-seeking. They're not more heroic. And they're not more prone to making big, bold moves." And I'm thinking, okay, well then, what sets these successful leaders apart from those that aren't? Here's what they said. They all led their teams with a surprising method of self-control in an out-of-control world. You see, church, in the end, it's not the flashy and it's not the flamboyant that survive. It is instead those with steady hands and sober minds. And it's people like this one that you see on the overhead now. His name is Roald Amundsen. And in 1911, Mr. Amundsen headed up a Norwegian team in a race to the South Pole. Now, he had a competitor. His name was Robert Scott. Robert Scott directed a team from England. And the two expeditions faced identical challenges and identical terrain because they're both trying to get to the South Pole first. They endured the same freezing temperatures and the same unforgiving environment. They had equal access to technology. They had equal access to the equipment of their day. Yet Amundsen and his team reached the South Pole 34 days ahead of Scott. So what made the difference? In a word, planning. Amundsen was a tireless strategist. He had a clear strategy, and this is what it was. He would travel 15 to 20 miles a day. Great weather, good weather, 15 to 20 miles. Bad weather, horrible weather, 15 to 20 miles. No more, no less. Always 15 to 20 miles. Scott, on the other hand, was very irregular. He would push his team to exhaustion on the good days and would stop altogether on the bad ones. The two men had two completely different philosophies and consequently two completely different outcomes. Amundsen won the race without losing a single explorer. Scott lost not only the race, but he eventually lost his own life and the lives of all of his team members on the return trip back to their base camp. Now, their base camp was some 150 miles away, but they were only 11 miles from the next depot where they could have found water, food, and rest. Scott lost his life and the lives of his teammates, all because he didn't have a plan. Now, we might prefer a miracle for our difficulties. We might prefer to see the bread multiplied in front of our eyes and maybe the stormy sea turn glassy calm with just a snap of the finger. And God, He might do that. I don't know. Then again, He may tell you, I'm with you. I can use this for good. Now let's make a plan. Church, trust Him to help you. God's sovereignty doesn't negate our responsibility. Actually, it's quite the opposite. It empowers our responsibility. When we trust God, we think a lot more clearly and more decisively. Kind of like the old prophet Nehemiah. Nehemiah said in the book named after him, Nehemiah chapter 4, verse 9, "We prayed to our God and posted a guard day and night to meet this threat." In summary, we prayed and we posted. And just to remind you what we're talking about here, remember that Nehemiah had had this passion in wanting to go back and restore the walls of Jerusalem that had been destroyed. And he asked the king that he was serving, he was the cupbearer, "Can I go back to Jerusalem and repair the walls?" And the king gave him basically a blank check and letters of authority to go do that very thing. The problem is that there were a few people in Jerusalem that didn't want to see Nehemiah succeed. They were literally trying to make him fail. They were literally trying to kill Nehemiah and his workers. So what they would do is they would post guards, and some would work, and some would be the guards, and then they'd have a shift change, and some would be the people working on the wall, and some were then guarding the post. And occasionally, they had people working on the walls with one hand and holding a sword with the other. That's why Nehemiah said, "We prayed to God and posted a guard day and night to meet this threat." That was the threat he was talking about. To threaten Nehemiah from being able to succeed in this plan of rebuilding the walls of Jerusalem. And so Nehemiah, in shorthand, said, "We prayed and we posted." And I think in our context today, maybe stated a little bit differently, we trust and we act. We trust God to do what we can't, and we obey God and do what we can. Don't let sometimes the difficulties of life just paralyze you. Don't let sadness overwhelm you. Don't let fear intimidate you. To do nothing is really the wrong thing. To do something is the right thing. And to believe is the highest thing. In the words of Moses, he says in Deuteronomy chapter 29, verse 29, "There are secrets the Lord our God has not revealed to us, but these words he has revealed are for us and our children to obey forever." So church, in difficult times, personally, in difficult times with our country, in difficult times in places away from our country where our veterans have fought and died and bled to protect this country. The shorthand for it is, when faced with those difficulties, keep calm and carry on. That's what God is trying to tell us, that even in the difficult times, I am there with you. Do what you can. Seek God's help for those things that you can't. And in the process, keep calm and carry on. And in this kind of tumultuous world we live in, both globally and even within the United States of America, it gets sometimes chaotic in terms of the rhetoric that's going on and the feelings that are being expressed. And we could have a tendency of just giving in to the chaos and just losing our minds. But what God wants us to understand is that in difficult times and circumstances, he's every bit as much there as he was before. He just simply wants us to put our trust into him, do what we can, trust God to do the rest, to keep calm, and to carry on. So we've picked a song that I think hopefully kind of embodies that. Justin, thank you. What a friend we have in Jesus. Think of a person in your life, or maybe several, who you would consider a close, trusted friend. If you were having difficulties, you could go to that friend and have a conversation, right? You could go to that friend and kind of be yourself. Because we all put on faces, depending upon what we're doing and circumstances that we're in, We might pretend to be somebody that we're not quite feeling that way inside, but because we have a job to do, then we put on our game face for the job. Or we put on our parent face because we have to have a difficult conversation with our kids. And in both of those circumstances, you're not really feeling quite up to it, but you put on the face. But when you're talking with your best friend, it's like, okay, you can kind of let your hair down, be yourself, get some counsel, get some advice, and see what he or she has to say. Well, you have that in Jesus. And what a friend he is. All of our griefs and sorrows we can bear to him. So this week, when faced with difficult circumstances, keep calm and carry on. Do what you can and pray to God for the things that you cannot do. Keep calm and carry on. If you have any prayer requests, you can pass those up as we sing this song. At the conclusion of the song, we'll read the prayer requests and then we'll be dismissed. Let's stand and let's sing.